This short podcast is on natural experiments in social science research. A natural experiment differs from a lab experiment and from a field experiment in that the treatment naturally varies in the real world. We do not control the level of that treatment or that independent variable. We instead assess whether natural changes in the independent variable lead to changes in the dependent variable. So let's give an example. For instance, the military draft is designed to be random. Everyone who is part of the population of participation has an equal chance of being selected in a military draft. Thus, we can use this randomization to separate people into drafted or not drafted groups. And we can ask the question, did being drafted in the military affect future earnings? We can compare income of individuals who are drafted versus individuals who are not drafted. In other words, use that post-test design in a natural experiment. So this is an example of how a natural experiment would work. Now, what of the validity of these natural experiments? The strength of the natural experiment is in its external validity. In other words, how the experiment matches up with the real world. And in this instance, we have real-world data. We know who was drafted and who was not drafted, and we're thus able to assign them into two different groups as in a classic experiment, and look to see how their income differed in the treatment. Where we have weaknesses are in the concept of internal validity. In other words, we can't definitively establish a causal pattern between being drafted and income. But we can certainly reduce, in terms of confounding factors, knowing that these people were assigned in random fashion, and thus have a decent experimental design. Still, it's weaker in terms of internal validity and stronger in terms of external validity. Now, very often, scholars analyze real-world data where the treatment is not randomly assigned. For instance, the effect of GDP per capita on immigration patterns in countries around the world. There's no random assignment in terms of GDP per capita. There's no random assignment in terms of sampling. And thus, we don't really have a natural experiment. Instead, we have what is called a non-experimental observational study, where we observe how GDP per capita has an effect on immigration patterns. Now, in this instance, we need to use statistical techniques to try to control for confounding factors. And that's the subject for a POLS 301 course, where we look pretty closely at those different statistical techniques to try to find valid inference in terms of figuring out the effect of our independent variable on our dependent variable. And that concludes this short podcast on natural experiments.